Good evening, Noura. How are you?
Well, how are you?
I'm good. We are starting the series titled What Have We Learned? And it's almost a year since this genocide started, and we are going to ask you to address 5 things, starting with international law, the United States, universities, Zionism, Palestinians, and then we'll end with where you think we're right now and where do you think we are headed. So I'll give you the floor, and if you have any initial comments, please feel free to share them. And then we're going to start with international law.
Sure. As you mentioned, we're edging up on a year since we've seen the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza conducted on an industrial scale, live streamed to an international community in what I think most of us would regard as the first time that we're watching a genocide take place in real time. And so in the course of what is now 11 months, we have thoroughly debunked the worst atrocities that we were told about what took place on October 7th, about beheaded babies, about opening up women's bodies, about a systematic campaign of mass rape, about who killed Israeli civilians in their homes. Here I'm referencing the Israeli Hannibal Doctrine and their own admittance that they've done that. All of these claims were made in order to prime audiences to be okay with large-scale deaths of Palestinians in large, unprecedented numbers. And we've debunked that. We've also done this work of providing context, of placing Gaza, which was ripped out of geographical and temporal context, back into that historical context. It is part of a Palestinian geography. It is part of a broader Middle East that has been subject to successive imperial regimes. It is part of a world history, and it's part of a history that certainly doesn't begin on October 7th in order to orient audiences to understand that this wasn't, the claims again that this was made about some maniacal Islamic militant organization that wanted to kill Jews, but instead framed it within a settler colonial context and a condition of permanent subjugation, what has been the expectancy of the permanent subjugation of Palestinian people. In addition to that, we have also heard the Israeli state tell us the quiet part out loud, that for them, they have foregone. This is not about the hostages. This is not about decimating Hamas, which they are not able to do militarily anyway. But for them, this is about a depopulation campaign, Nakba 2.0, the Gaza Nakba. It is to continue a process of ethnic cleansing from the river to the sea in order to resolve what Israel and Zionism more generally has set up as its primary challenge, which is what to do with the natives when settler sovereign seeks to take their place and defines their sovereignty as establishing a demographic majority. Together with that, we've had 2 ICJ decisions, 1 advisory opinion and an ICJ decision in a contentious case. We have a request for arrest warrants from the ICC. We have lawsuits within U.S. federal courts and across national jurisdictions internationally. We've had one of the greatest upheavals of our time in what were the university encampments. And so after a year of all of that, there really is so little left to say. So little left to teach, certainly for expertise. And so the idea now is to help, not to provide 5 lessons, but to consolidate so much of what we've seen into these 5 themes that you're highlighting.
Let's start by you telling us what we have learned about international law.
Absolutely. So international law, we already start from this assumption and this cynicism, rightfully so, that international law might not even be law. Because if it did have the capacity to punish or to regulate behavior, right, then we wouldn't be where we are now. There wouldn't have been a Nakba. There wouldn't have been a lack of redress of Palestinian refugees. There wouldn't be a so-called military occupation that has become permanent. There wouldn't be a permanent war on Palestinians who are besieged, who are supposed to, be have a responsibility from the occupying power to protect them. If the law were doing what it was supposed to do, right, we wouldn't even be here in the first place. But that's assuming that that's what the law was supposed to do. And so what we have learned, even more so about international law, is that in fact it continues to exhibit a colonial nature. International law in so many ways was developed in the service of imperial expansion. And here, when we think about the Genocide Convention, even though on its face the purpose of it is to protect peoples from annihilation based on their racial, ethnic, national, religious identities, consider the fact that there had been many different annihilations of peoples that had not been condemned, not the transatlantic slave trade, not the annihilation of indigenous peoples across even just thinking about North America. We have not seen the condemnations of the annihilation of the Nama Herero people in Germany, and yet the first time that there is a prescription in law within a multilateral treaty on a world scale happens at the moment that this annihilation takes place within Europe's shores. There is a concern with Europe's conception of itself. Now, part of that also reflects the ways in which the laws of war themselves have developed, where they have set aside Africans, people of East Asia, of the Americas, of what we know as the Middle East, set aside brown and black peoples as the savage other. What does that mean? Think about the main thing that we think of in genocide or in the laws of war. There shall be no targeting of civilians. In genocide, it's no targeting of civilians for the purpose of their destruction based on these protected identities. In the laws of war, no targeting of civilians who are not combatants, who are not partaking in hostilities. They're supposed to be a protected class. In the development of laws of war, brown and black peoples are considered the savage other. They were evacuated from the category of the civilian to begin with. So in this moment that we're seeing the Genocide Convention failing to recognize, I think unanimously, because obviously there's recognition, but the unanimous recognition of this moment as this campaign as a genocide is the fact that Palestinians have not been eligible for that civilian status to begin with. Now, that's part of what I was explaining about the history of the drafting of the Genocide Convention, but it also goes into what the Genocide Convention says and doesn't say. So just as by way of example, as part of the drafting history, there was a proposal to include ethnic cleansing as part of genocide, and yet that proposal was definitely defeated, so that you can have a campaign for the purpose of ethnic cleansing, which in many cases, especially for Native peoples who are attached to their lands, is a form of destruction. And yet what the Genocide Convention does is create this thin line that distinguishes between ethnic cleansing and genocide. And we've seen that most recently in genocide jurisprudence. So these are the things. Now, this is what we know. And for those of us who are scholars, for example, third world approaches to international law, this is precisely what we study and seek to illuminate. And what these 11 months have shown us now is shown the world these fault lines. And it's what, in the words of Professor Nimir Sultani, he would describe as an epic legal battle between the global north and the global south, because we see that this fault line isn't necessarily congealed and sturdy, but is still quite contentious in a way, in the ways that we see, South Africa, which defeated the hegemony of the global north and trying to maintain apartheid rule over them and Afrikaner supremacy, white supremacy over them, bring this case to the International Court of Justice. We also see it when we see the late Namibian president now tell Germany that it has no right to tell us what is and is not a genocide based on its legacy. We see Nicaragua bringing a case against Germany for the sale of weapons. And so it's very much this fault line that's developed and illuminating this colonial nature. The last thing that I'm going to say about the law and something to consider, and it's bringing us full circle back to the first point, the law isn't regulating behavior. The law isn't punishing transgressions, but the law is doing something. And one example that I'll give is the fact that if we were to stay on the grounds of laws of war, which is what Israel would like to do. It would like to describe, transgressions as war crimes, crimes against humanity. They killed the wrong civilians, they targeted civilians, they were fighting a legitimate war that had very tragic outcomes that are criminal in nature, versus genocide, where the purpose in and of itself is illegitimate because these civilians are not tragically killed because they are collateral damage in the pursuit of a legitimate target, but that those civilians were the target to begin with. So one of the things that international law has did, despite all of its shortcomings, is allow us to shift those grounds in order to have a different conversation, and now to have it with the color of the principal judicial organ of the United Nations in the form of the ICJ.
There's a lot to say about the United States, and a lot of people have different approaches, but the reality is that the United States' role has been far more than vital in this genocide. How would you approach this topic? What have we learned about the United States in this past year?
I think the best way to summarize what we've seen now, again after 11 months, is that this is a U.S. genocide of Palestinians, that it's not merely aiding and abetting, but very much a U.S. genocide. Everything that we can say about the United States has historically played a primary role in advancing Israel's settler colonial ambitions. And we see that where they assume the role of imperial patron, taking the place of Britain and France after 1967, where they assume that mantle and begin to provide Israel with unequivocal military, economic, and diplomatic support. And so none of that was in question. We see their role during the so-called peace process and being the so-called honest broker, of basically doing what Aaron David Miller has described as being Israel's lawyer. None of that is new. What we see perhaps as a different shade in this moment is that the U.S. is actively participating in the genocide of Palestinians through the provision, I think firstly and foremostly, through the provision of weapons. What Israelis have explicitly said, they could not conduct their operations were it not for this U.S. steady and incessant flow of weapons, but that in fact, because of their excessive nature, it also is why Israel is engaged in a reckless campaign of targeting Palestinians without any regard. Now, add to that the fact that the U.S. is doing this while doing a few other things. Firstly and foremostly, it's using its veto power within the Security Council in order to obstruct a meaningful ceasefire resolution that would bring an end to the genocide. In addition to that, it is subverting its own laws and processes in order to continue this genocide. We know that explicitly when something like 70% of Democrats want a ceasefire, and yet a democratic establishment refuses to fulfill this popular will of its base. We know that when the U.S. is creating new laws in order to subvert accountability. Take, for example, just in a bipartisan vote, something 269 to 144 that the U.S. House of Representatives passed, which prohibits the State Department from citing the Gaza Ministry of Health statistics on Palestinian casualties. We will not know the number. They are engaging in outright censorship at the same time that there is no media allowed to cover this, and that Palestinian journalists have been systematically targeted. So that there is both censorship happening as well as a refusal to allow us access to the actual numbers. And the irony here, of course, is that we keep getting told how many Hamas militants are being killed and yet can't be told how many Palestinian civilians are killed. There's an outright collusion that's happening here. Worse than that, you have the US violating its own laws in order to continue the transfer of these weapons. Laws like the Arms Export Control Act, laws like the Leahy Amendment, laws that make it that stipulate that the US shall not provide arms to a belligerent state that uses them in the violation of US law and international law. Or take, for example, even US law section 620I on the Foreign Assistance Act, which stipulates that no recipient of US weapons shall receive those weapons if that same recipient is blocking US humanitarian aid, which has been the case in Gaza, as evidenced by the dropping of aid from the sky and by building a so-called port for humanitarian assistance. All of this paints a picture for us, right? That there is a subversion of democratic will, that there is an abrogation of its own laws, that there is a dismantling of international mechanisms that should be doing the job to subvert this very kind of genocidal campaign, whether at the Security Council or the threats that have been wielded against the ICC prosecutor in the request for arrest warrants, together with the fact that even internally we see, a subversion of these processes. And I end here only to make the point that for so many that want to distinguish over here, something domestic, from over there, what they are missing is that those things are collapsed and entwined when it comes to US state violence. We see this evidenced also historically in the way that US polices. We see it in the development of US police forces at the end of the Spanish-American War, here citing sociologist Julian Go, that we see the transformation of US law enforcement to then mirror the transformation of US military forces, which becomes an imperial power, in a way that we see in policing. And if it's not as clearly evident, it will become increasingly evident. But we already see, for example, the policing of protesters at Cop City using anti-terrorism laws. We already see censorship across communities and university campuses, anti-BDS, which subverts First Amendment rights. All those things that you think of are about over there are actually part of what affects how the U.S. is also being transformed, continuing the legacy of what Martinican poet and essayist Amy Césaire describes as the boomerang effect. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. No one is safe by allowing Palestinians to die. Palestinians are not the lowest hanging fruit that needs to be sacrificed in order to fulfill a progressive agenda. We are the canaries in the coal mine, and letting us die will not make anyone safer.
Can you tell us about the universities or the university as a site of contention, whether it is a site of coercion or an extension of the state, or whether it is a site of protest? Can you tell us what we've learned about universities?
I'll start with what everybody has seen in the university setting. We have seen the university setting, rather than be a site of independent knowledge production and academic freedom, a site of enlightenment and empowering the future leaders of the world to fulfill their political agency, their political social agency. We have seen them abrogate that very responsibility by punishing their students for acting upon their agency, even within the university, to hold it to account. We've seen them bring in police to engage in police brutality. We've seen them attack their own faculty. We've seen them not even having a fidelity to those primary documents, as one would take it, the primary documents of empirical evidence, the primary documents that have now been produced by the International Court of Justice, there is an abrogation of that very duty. Now, what I think that we've learned more, however, is that the university has shown itself to be an extension of a coercive state apparatus rather than to be separate from it. And there are many explanations for it. One explanation that I pull on is the fact that the university, public universities especially, have been subject to severe austerity measures where the federal budget, public spending on universities continues to shrink, and it now has to scramble in order to make up for windfalls. That's why you see increasing numbers, for example, of adjunct professors who have precarious forms of employment without benefits. That's why you see a number of programs cut, and so on and so forth. But as this is happening, as the university is experiencing austerity, simultaneously large weapons, or what you would call defense industries, have seen their budget balloon. We see this ballooning of 5 primary weapons manufacturers, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing expand in the aftermath of September 11th, balloon literally in that aftermath. And that there is actually a relationship between that expansion of budget and the truncation of the university budget, because now a lot of these industries are actually funding these bankrupt universities, bankrolling them. Consider, for example, just in 2020 alone, Lockheed Martin received more funding than all of the Department of Education. Consider also, and here I'll pull on some notes, that at Johns Hopkins, they received twice as much money from defense contractors over 10 years than all of the tuition that they've received from students. So we have a condition where the universities are also now beholden to their donors in a way that I think is manifesting in an abrogation of their duty. You know, this can help explain the phenomenon, as well as the betrayal of the very students that they are meant to empower, shape, protect, and send out in the world, but instead have declared war upon them, and declared them almost as enemies, to make their employment less possible, to make their empowerment less possible, and to literally be an arm of a coercive state apparatus.
The term Zionism is quite contentious. Instead of asking you several questions, which I would like to ask, let me just ask you generally, what have we learned during the past year about Zionism?
You know, I would say that unfortunately we haven't learned enough. I think that due to the anemic conversation around racism and colonialism, particularly in the United States, that it's the very topic that should be discussed and yet which has been avoided. And instead, there has been an attempt to collapse Zionism, a political movement and ideology that seeks to establish a settler sovereign in the place of a native Palestinian population where they already existed and sought to assert their self-determination as a political community, collapse with the identity of being Jewish in the world. And not only is that dishonest, but it's failing to have a conversation about what is the root cause of what we're seeing. Zionism, for most of us who study it and have tried to continue providing racial theory and colonial theory about it as a political ideology, as a intellectual and political bedfellow of apartheid, a similar kind of ideology, we have said in theory that the end goal of it, that it's taken to its logical conclusion, right, is a form of the complete erasure and removal of Palestinians. It is an unquenchable thirst, in the words of Fayez Sayegh, for land in order to continue expansion. It is the constant framing as ipso facto the Palestinian native as a security threat, regardless of whether or not they actually pose a threat to anybody, that their threat is that they just exist. And even though we have tried to show this in law and practice and the quotidian activities, right, of living under Zionist settler colonization, what we've seen right now is Zionism actually producing that logical end, right, that outcome, which is genocide. It's the erasure of Palestinians altogether. And it's that erasure with a righteousness to do so. It is an Israeli society that is debating the right to rape detainees. It is an Israeli society that is mocking Palestinians. It's an Israeli society that actually objects to any kind of sympathy for Palestinians or criticism of the government. It's a right to complete a genocide and what they think is necessary for their own self-defense. And it's a state that's doing so in their name using industrial weapons technology that is requiring the rest of the world to be suppressed politically in order to do what they're saying is getting the job done or finishing the job.
And so what we have seen about Zionism, right, is that the project, right, is done. Israel has failed as a project. Zionism has been has become bankrupt of any kind of moral thrust, and that's significant because Zionism historically was supported very much across broad spectrums of people at the United Nations by leading thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, who understood it as a model for liberation of oppressed peoples. That's where it was functioning on some moral, gas. And here what we have in this moment is a complete moral bankruptcy, where no one is supporting Zionism from that place. Instead, there are very few people who are supporting it outright. And those who aren't, there would be more people protesting it if they weren't afraid of harassment, doxing, loss of gainful employment, or some sort of punishment. And so one
really, I think, illuminating example of this is in the way that AIPAC and even the ADL is operating. I mean, we see the ADL now unfurling programs across university campuses in order to support the universities in suppressing their student bodies. They are literally coordinating with modes of suppression in the name of protecting minorities. I mean, this is how morally bereft this project has become. But AIPAC used to basically wield a very quiet force in Washington and in halls of power, where now we see them wielding very explicitly their stick, not even just wielding their stick, but threatening their stick. That if you do not vote in this way, we can also undermine your political campaigns. So nobody is supporting AIPAC because they believe in, they believe in the right to continue to displace Palestinians, to remove them, to slaughter children who are placed in rice bags in order to be buried. You have people who are thinking very self-interested, I don't want to be punished. That's a moral bankruptcy. So AIPAC's interference, for example, in Cori Bush's campaign in Missouri, we see explicitly the institution pour $8.4 million to support her opposition. But note, with all that money, none of the ads that ran against Bush mentioned Israel. She was not defeated because of a support for Palestinian liberation. She was defeated on grounds that had to do with, the infrastructure bill, how she voted while in office, which indicates, again, that there's no moral cachet here. In that now moving forward, we see Zionism being mobilized from the top down as a form of coercive force, but not something that's generating sympathy and support naturally from those who are moved by sensibilities of justice. And that is in stark contrast to the way that the world has mobilized around Palestinian liberation.
Speaking of Palestinians and Palestinian liberation, there's clearly so much to say. What have we learned during the past year about Palestinians, whether in the West Bank and Gaza or anywhere?
I think the way that I would summarize what we've learned about Palestinians is their invisibility, the duality of their invisibility and their power that's happening simultaneously. So on the one hand, we see Palestinians being completely invisibilized and dehumanized by world superpowers who are not recognizing Palestinians as made of flesh, not recognizing that they have a life of dignity and a normal life to return to, not recognizing that mothers grieve, that fathers grieve, that there's love for one another. There has been such a thorough dehumanization of Palestinians in order to again prime audiences to accept their deaths. And this is the work that racism is doing. It's enabling people to expect Palestinians to die so that they can be left to die, right? And at the same time that racism is functioning in this way. And we see that racism, I think, really explicitly after April 2024, when where there was outrage over the killing of Israeli targeting of civilians, but it was the targeting of 7 World Food Cafe humanitarian aid workers. It wasn't, by that time, there were 35,000 Palestinians who had been killed, and they hadn't generated the same type of mobilization from media, for example, as these 7 World Food Cafe World Food Kitchen had mobilized in that moment. It's when we see, for example, the Wall Street Journal for the first time say explicitly, Israel is nowhere near a strategic victory. It has not, retrieved its hostages, and it's nowhere closer to decimating Hamas as it's saying, because they were the killing of these civilians, the targeting of them, created an existential crisis again. That the deaths of Palestinians, that the destruction of their universities, that the destruction of their hospitals, that the targeting of their journalists, that the sounds of children crying, that the sound of 6-year-old Hind Rajab telling the world that she's scared, will somebody come to help her, had not generated. And so here we are experiencing the thorough dehumanization. And at the same time, we're also seeing the incredible power of Palestinians, the incredible power to literally change the world, to illuminate, as we, started at the top, they illuminate the colonial nature of the world. They make clear, they have created a fracture between the global north and the global south. They have literally, in the words of Yazan Zaza, who pointed out that it was Palestinians who made it evident that Biden couldn't run a second term. And yet Palestinians are not thanked for any of this, because in the psyche, they just don't exist. They only emerge as threats, but never as agents, never as humans. And so again, we're seeing the power of Palestinians, an extraordinary power that we've seen in citizen journalists like Bassam Haddad and Hind Khudari. Power that we continue to see, even recently when we saw 6 Palestinian prisoners use spoons to dig themselves out of one of the highest security prisons in the world. It's the power of individuals like Dr. Amira Suli. If you remember, she was the doctor who flung off a cape and ran across in front of the hospital where there was sniper fire in order to retrieve the body of a patient and bring him back in order to be healed. We see the power of doctors who are functioning in horrific conditions where there's no aid left. We see the power of teachers who are creating makeshift schools. We see this resilience, this power to do with Rafif Ziadeh has pointed out to us in teaching all of us life. And that is, I think, where the international community, in the form of the millions and millions of civil society who have also taken tremendous risks, have drawn their inspiration from this well of power, of what is possible. We live in a world that was constructed, which means that we can construct another world. And Palestinians have been a guiding light about what it will take, the resilience, the power, the faith, conviction, and love of one another in order to usher that other world that we deserve.
As we wrap up, I'd like to ask you to let us know where you think we are right now, and or where do you think we are headed? And you don't have to answer this question. You can just leave it at where you left things off.
The thing I want to say about this moment is something that I say to myself, because it's a very troubling moment. It's a very troubling moment where there is a genocide that's continuing after what we said is approximating a year. And we have done all the work in order to expose, in order to teach, in order to mobilize, in order to, get the international court decisions, in order to apply the sanctions and the weapons, and yet we still see it continuing. And not only that, but we see a re-entrenchment, what I would describe as a counter-revolutionary moment, where we have pushed so far, so far, that there is only two places to go from here. Either you're going to go forward in dismantling, not only ending the genocide, but actually dismantling Zionism and its institutions of racial supremacy and colonial structures, decolonization, or you're going to go backwards. And you're going to push back on all of those gains that have been made. And I think that we are, for those of us in the United States at least, are certainly seeing this counter-revolutionary moment in them in pushing back. We see it in journalistic coverage, where the old, hackneyed talking points are being resurrected without shame. For correspondents to be saying the talking point that it's actually Hamas human shield that's causing these high levels of deaths, when we have heard doctors tell us that they are treating children, they have seen children who have been sniped in the head, that mass graves have been found of people zip-tied and executed, where we know that journalists, their press vests have become targets. They have the audacity, where we have learned that there are no safe zones. There are no safe zones in which to take refuge. The audacity then to lie to audiences still after all this and say that you attribute these deaths to human shields is counter-revolutionary. When we see the United States not only abrogate Genocide Convention, international law as well, undermine the Security Council effort to impose a ceasefire, undermine international legal accountability, also undermine its own laws that regulates the sale and the transfer of weapons. After all that, to see the United States suddenly want to prosecute 43 Hamas militants under federal criminal law, when they're already designated by the State Department as a terrorist organization and already endure material and criminal consequences. It's that moment of desperation that we see that they are wanting to backtrack. Even in an election year, we are seeing the repetition by the Democratic candidate, who is repeating again allegations of a systematic nature of mass rape without even reference to what we have seen with our own eyes in the form of sexual assault by Israelis against men, women, and children. And I think all of that represents a weakness and a counter-revolutionary moment, and indicates to us that we need to just keep pushing, because this is trying to make us regress, but precisely because, and make us regress in the most authoritarian, dishonest, top-down, heavy-handed ways, precisely in response to the effect that we've had and how far we have pushed and how much more we need to push. I think that's where we're at. And I think that we've done this. Most of it is a sacrifice that Palestinians have made that no people should ever have had to made. We should be able to get here and have been here for much sooner. And if we don't do it now, the worst will still come and be repeated in the forms of the atrocities that we've seen and we've had to bear witness Palestinians endure. So we're in this moment where, again, we are experiencing, I think, a moment where we have, our power, our tremendous power, and simultaneously a reactionary response to that power.
Thank you very much, Noura. We've exhausted you, but we are very grateful for your time, and we hope to continue speaking with you.
I look forward to it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.